Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back. Black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. Welcome to season 14 of Left to Black. And we are so happy to be joined by Professor Treva B. Lindsey, who is Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at The Ohio State University, also founder of the Transformative Black Feminism Initiative in Columbus, Ohio, which also includes the Black Feminist Night School at Zora's House. She's the author of Colored No More, Reinventing Black Womanhood in Washington, D.C., published by Illinois in 2017, and she is joining us today to talk about her latest book, America Goddam, Violence, Black Women, and the Struggle for Justice, published by the University of California Press 2022. Paperback just dropped in 2023. Of America Goddam, Kiese Layman writes, America Goddam is far more profoundly singular than any so-called intervention. It is more dynamic than any of our literary monuments. Lindsey manages to recast racial terror by finding the rhythm created by Black women task with outrunning and resisting racialized gender terror in the United States. America Goddam should make us all who purport to write through racial gender terror and liberation revise everything we thought. I'm gutted by its brilliance. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's good to be back.
So you joined us season 1.
Wow.
I want to say episode 2.
I think that sounds right.
What does it mean? What does it look like for a Black woman to healthily express sexuality within the context of popular culture, right?
You joined us again, I want to say around season 4.
Right.
And most recently, I think season 8.
How important HBCUs are in terms of maintaining and producing culture and being a space in which Black students primarily are educated about the wealth of creativity, of ingenuity, of innovation.
It's great to have you. I think you and E. Patrick Johnson are the folks who have appeared most consistently on the show.
Oh, yes, I love that title.
And it says something about, I think, the area, because in both your cases and E. Patrick's case, they were here in studio.
Yes.
So it's always good to have you back here.
Wonderful to be back.
In Durham.
Yes.
So this book, and let me start with the writing. I've been reading your writing for 20 years. Scholarly work, the public-facing work. The move that you make with this book, the marrying of the analytical, the critical with your personal voice is really striking. I would say more so than anything that I've read of yours before. Talk about finding this balance in your writing, a maturation maybe, even in your writing?
So when I thought about writing a book about violence against Black women and girls, the task for me was figuring out what is the voice of this book, what is the heart of this book, what are the stakes of this book, and also who I was accountable to with this book, which is a very different question from writing a book where I'm exploring a historical topic to kind of prove my chops as a historian, or amplifying the stories of Black women in the late 19th and early 20th century, which the stakes are there for that as well, of what it means to recover histories, what it means to think about race, gender, class, and sexuality in the Jim Crow era, with Black women at the center of that story. But the stakes just felt so much higher, because as I was writing this, incidents that I'm covering in the book are unfolding, or incidents similar to the incidents that I write about in the book are unfolding. And as a survivor of multiple forms of violence, and as a Black woman, it felt important to think about this book as an opportunity not just to bear witness to these atrocities, to this systemic invisibilizing of what happens to Black women, girls, and gender expansive people, but to also bear witness And that witness practice led me to this auto-theoretical approach to the book, which meant that not only was I telling my own stories about violence, but I was using the archive, I was using studies, I was engaging commentary and other pieces to figure out how to tell this story as complexly as it deserved, while never losing the heart of it. I wanted this work to be thought-provoking, but more so than that, I wanted it to be care-provoking work. And I thought that that lent itself well to including that personal aspect, that auto-theoretical approach to such a dense and important topic.
You are trained as a historian, though you've never simply thought of yourself as a historian, right? But this is a book about archives.
Yes.
And you write about who doesn't show up in the archive, or who does show up in the archive, right? We talk about anti-Black violence all the time, and we seem to go to the same kinds of victims.
Yes.
Right? What you do in this book is explore the wider breadth and depth of that anti-Black, that archive of anti-Black violence, to find all these stories that are so clear and apparent to us about Black women and girls, but we never seem to pay any attention to them.
And as I was writing this book and ultimately kind of putting it together is when Breonna Taylor is killed by police in Louisville, Kentucky.
I don't know what's happening. Somebody kicked in the door inside my girlfriend.
Her death sparked nationwide outrage and anguish. 26-year-old medical worker Breonna Taylor shot and killed by Louisville police officers shortly after midnight on March 13th while executing a search warrant.
It was the first time since the death of Sandra Bland in police custody that I actually saw an uproar in a different kind of way than I'm used to seeing when we get these very spectacular moments of violence against Black women and girls. And part of that is because it's happening at the moment that it actually happens 2 months prior to George Floyd being killed and having a video that's filmed by a Black girl, right, of the last 10 minutes of his life. But we're then brought the story of Breonna Taylor because there are people on the ground in Louisville doing this work, but it becomes a national story because George Floyd has been killed, that we also have the Ahmaud Arbery murder by vigilantes that's happening. So she's part of a story. She's not the singular story, but she does become an important name in terms of reckoning with the reality of police violence in ways that I had not seen prior to that point with regards to that, in spite of the Say Her Name report from the African American Policy Forum, in spite of the work of folks within the Black Lives Matter Global Network attempting to amplify the stories of women, girls, and gender expansive people, that often those stories weren't told, let alone the stories that are very intimate, that are interpersonal, that are about medical violence, that are about the violence of poverty, that are about the violence of Black women and girls going missing, right? These are not the stories we were hearing. And those are not the stories, unfortunately, that we're getting mobilized around in a large scale way either. And so this was an attempt to put that archive that's still being added to every minute of every day somewhere that we can say, you cannot ignore this. You cannot ignore this reality and the various factors that are contributing to this being the reality for Black women and girls.
Breonna Taylor's story resonates in other ways in the book because you write about the number of Black women who were killed in their own homes.
Yes.
Right, so this idea that if you stay inside, right, that you'll be protected from this violence. And obviously there are the cases of the interpersonal violence that occurred in the home. We're talking about state violence that's occurring inside someone's home.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that dynamic.
So, in noticing, when I'm looking at all of these cases, and again, this is comprehensive but by no means exhaustive in terms of this kind of roll call of those who've been harmed by police and fatally harmed in this case, right? You see so many of them happening in front of their homes. Breonna Taylor while she's sleeping, Tanisha Anderson when she's in a mental health crisis and in need of help, who's killed in front of her home, in front of her family.
Tanisha Anderson arrived at the hospital at 11 minutes past midnight on November the 13th in full cardiac arrest. That's about an hour and 20 minutes after police first arrived outside her home at 10:46 in the evening. It was a call to get mental health assistance for Anderson. But the family said after Tanisha grew agitated, police threw her to the ground, handcuffed her, and placed a knee in her back.
Deborah Danner, the reason we have the term officer-involved shooting as a way to talk about police violence when it becomes popularized is around the killing of Eula Love in Los Angeles in the late 1970s.
This is where Mrs. Eula Love stood the day the shooting took place. There was an officer here, an officer there. She held a knife in her hand. There was a scuffle, the knife was knocked out of her hand. She reached for it, and as she threw it, the officers opened fire.
This was a justifiable homicide committed by the officers in their own self-defense.
And so the home, this safe space, it doesn't function in that way. It's certainly not safe from the state, and we know that from interventions around child welfare services. We know that for the work of someone like Dorothy Roberts, her most recent book, Torn Apart, came out the same day as America Goddam, and really we're so interconnected because so much of the violence that Black women encounter at the hands of the state also comes through systems that are supposedly of protection and service. And we think about policing, at least in the ideal for some people, is that this is a force that protects and serves. And what we see is them encountering Black women in their homes, in front of their homes, is one of danger, is one of violence, and is one that constantly unfolds in ways that make that woman less safe.
The police violence against Black women is probably the most obvious aspect of this conversation. The interpersonal violence also is there. But you talk about other kinds of dynamics, right? The violence that comes with lack of resources.
Yes.
The violence that comes with being part of the medical industrial complex.
Yes.
Right? Talk a little bit about why it was important to bring those elements of violence against Black women and girls into the conversation.
Yes. So in my first book, Colored No More, I dedicated it to a young Black girl who went missing in my hometown of Washington, D.C., Relisha Rudd.
One phone call might be all it takes to bring this child back to us. Relisha Rudd. You know the name, and you certainly know that face. This is Relisha when she was 8. It's how old she was when she disappeared.
Initially, I just wanted her there so she would always be somewhere. If we found her, then she knew that we never forgot her. But if we never found her this world, she was always somewhere, that we knew she existed, we knew that she mattered. But I wanted to know the story behind Relisha. I wanted to understand, how does this Black girl who was unhoused, who is at the intersection of so many systemic failures, becomes illustrative of a larger issue around the violence of poverty, around the violence of capitalism, that we can see that through the life of this Black girl. So we can see that through a mother who's living with addiction, trying to figure that out, but how she's criminalized in that context, which makes her vulnerable to state violence, which in turn makes her daughter more vulnerable to multiple forms of violence. I wanted to understand how we can look at poverty not just as a condition, but rather an ongoing act of violence, which tells us something about how capitalism operates in the lives of Black women, girls, and gender-expansive people. And it was important for me to name that as violence and to name that kind of harm, because what happened to Relisha at every stage of her young life was violent and harmful.
This could have been anybody's child out here. I've been humiliated. I've been treated like a suspect. And because I am Relisha's mother and Relisha is my daughter, we both are a victim.
It meant something to also contextualize that within the medical industrial complex. And as I was writing this book, we were confronted with this unknown virus that we come to know as COVID-19 and have to grapple with the disproportionate impact it was going to have on Black communities, whether as caretakers, essential workers, or as the first victims that are claimed within that. But also we're starting to talk about maternal morbidity in robust ways. So when even someone like a Serena Williams is talking about not being trusted or believed by medical professionals, what does that mean for the average Black birthing person going through that experience. And so I wanted to name the violence of pathologizing Black women, girls, and birthing people. I wanted to name the violence of bad mother tropes that disproportionately impact Black women and girls and other birthing people. And I wanted to ensure that we are wrestling with this in conjunction with the interpersonal, with the state violence that we understand as like police violence, right? That all of these are mechanisms of policing a societal order in which Black women, girls, and gender expansive people are constantly under attack.
You came to Dorm in 2022, did a book event with Melissa Harris Perry.
Yes.
Rafifa Books. While everyone is there raptured by your language and the conversation, an accident occurs outside, right? Thankfully not tragic, but an accident nonetheless. You were the first person out of the bookstore negotiating what was happening outside, triaging, really. And it struck me at that moment, and I had a conversation with your mother about it afterwards. You're someone who is always willing to stand in the gap. And you do that in that book, and I want to talk about two different instances in the book where you are standing in the gap. One is you traveling with your mother in DC, and you see an act of interpersonal violence, and you intercede. Talk about why the practice of standing in the gap for you is as important as the praxis of standing in the gap.
What a wonderful question. And I wonder about this for myself, about the practice and the praxis of doing this work. But I come to Black feminism as someone who was so skeptical of it as an intellectual project, as a political project, as someone who was asking the question of what does this have to do with Black women, not knowing this longer and more robust history of Black women radicals and Black women who absolutely ground what we think of as feminist praxis and practice. But part of showing up in that way in those moments where I'm witnessing is that witnessing that I talk about in the book, that I want to show up in the ways that so many that I know, including myself, were not shown up for in those moments of violence. That understanding that this young woman who I talk about in the book, who's just been assaulted and left by her partner, and when the police and paramedics arrive and her partner returns, that suddenly her partner also becomes someone who's in need of protection as well. That my Black feminist politics give me a lens to understand that everyone there is unsafe, and how do we hold our own down in those moments? And by our own, I mean vulnerable people. And still hold accountable that this person has harmed this woman, but now we're all in the lane of harm, right, by being present there. But if we're in that together, there's a different outcome that becomes possible in my mind. You know, I think about this in the context of, you know, more recently, the Montgomery Brawl, where we see a Black man being attacked and these people come and save, and there's this groundswell on social media and everything about, yes, we don't play about ours, you know, we can get this and all that. And then a few weeks later, we see an incident in which a Black woman student is assaulted. And brings on with her, no one intervenes. In fact, people go so far as to researching her social media to prove why she didn't need to be defended. And while there are real questions about safety and what it means to intervene and what you're putting on the line when you intervene in violent situations, I found it quite deflating that it was with ease that we could celebrate and make shirts and hats and all
talk
kinds
about
of paraphernalia.
Celebrate showing up,
Showing up for one another. But when it was a young Black woman at the center of that everyone wanted to absolve responsibility and have these broader conversations about what it means to protect a Black woman who has no connection to you. And so I wanted to honor that in everything that I do with this work. This work means a lot to me as someone who writes about and documents Black women's history, but it also matters to me because Black women are dying as I'm talking about having this conversation here. And so if there are any moments where I can intercede, I want to be present because I've also developed a set of politics and tools to be strategic in how we intercede. So I think about someone like Meg Thee Stallion, who I write about in the book as well. And at the time, the shooting had just happened. And I knew what she would face the moment she identified Tory Lanez as the person who shot her. And because of social media, it only became viral that thing happened. And in talking to our friend and amazing colleague and cultural critic writer, Joe Morgan, about what it meant for her to cover the Tyson trial. And then to see the coverage of this trial and how similar the conversation was. And so I take it upon myself as a Black feminist, indebted to Black feminists, to show up because I know that that's the narrative. I know that a lot of people won't stop and intervene. And personally, I don't want that on my conscience, but also there was something to be done in that moment that felt possible.
You talk about witness and withness. You share your own experience with sexual violence at the hands of law enforcement.
Yes.
And you talk about the challenge of having not shared the story.
Yes.
And, the shame that went along with it.
Yes.
And finally being in a position to talk about it, to talk openly about it, to frame it within this larger tragedy of violence against Black women. Talk about the choice that you made to reveal what you did.
That was one of the most difficult choices in the book, and I think I've reread that page maybe once, that section of the book. I really tried to put it out of my mind as an experience, even as someone who had identified as a survivor of sexual violence.
And you were 17,
yes.
Right? That's the other thing.
Yes,
right?
I was 17 when it occurred, but I had already experienced sexual violence by that age, and that's what I had become when I started to talk more openly about my experiences with violence. It's almost like I just skipped that part of my story with violence.
Yeah.
And as I was writing this book, as I was in my home by myself, dealing with the grief of so much, the grief of losing my father, the grief of
COVID,
being away from family, grief of COVID, seeing so much loss in the world, the uprisings of 2020 and what we were uprising against, right? The reality of that I really had to come to grips with what happened. I had never said it out loud that that's a thing, even to myself, that that's what happened or identified it as a sexual assault. But I knew that when I saw the statistics and the data around sexual violence and policing, I started to see myself in that incident more clearly. And I wanted to be present with the women and girls and gender expansive people in that book. I think I'm laying bare so much of their vulnerability, their families' pain, and there's an ethical framework to America, Goddam. I didn't want to just see these as names, hashtags, examples. One of the reasons I try and use first names when I'm talking about the individuals, or deliver some note about who they were prior to this spectacular moment where they become known to us.
You mentioned about the little girls who were bombed in
Right,
Birmingham.
in Alabama.
Right?
So it's Cynthia, it's Addie, it's Denise, it's Carol. And they were brownies and musicians and sold things door to door. Like, I wanted to have a life-affirming practice to talking about death-dealing systems. And to be life-affirming and to lay bare the vulnerabilities of all of these families and communities, I felt responsible for aligning myself with them in that moment, and not just as a spectator, but as someone who was with them in this experience and trying to figure things out. So there is a part of me that is present in this book that had never been present before.
You talk about doing an interview here in Durham almost 20 years ago, and you unknowingly to yourself outed yourself as a survivor.
Yes.
But the follow-up phone call to your parents to let them know, you know, that you were a survivor, what was that like?
It was a very difficult conversation. I am very fortunate to have had parents who I felt like I could talk to about anything,
Right.
that I had such an open relationship with them. I, you know, came a generation, I know that people are like, I'm not your friend, I'm not one of your little friends, but in many ways, the Lindseys absolutely are two of my favorite people. And I felt like I felt safe with them, but there was something about telling them this reality. And both of them being in education, my father having been in law enforcement in different capacities, and having so many students who were at the nexus of
Right.
multiple marginalization,
Right.
that they were consistently encountering students who had been sexually violated, harmed, witnessed violence, experienced violence, been violent, right, whatever kind of combination of things. And I think they really had felt good about the fact that their daughter hadn't experienced so many of the things that the hundreds and thousands of children that they encountered had. And so to tell them, you know, hey, this happened, and it's not your failure, it's not
Right.
my failure,
Right.
it's not a shame, it's not a guilt you should feel, but I knew that's what would come up for them. Because they're also trying to find language around post-violence, right? I think about my graduate student now, Dr. Mahalia Little, and she does this incredible work on post-violent sexuality of Black women, because so many Black women who are figuring out their sexuality, walking in their sexuality, moving in their sexuality, are post-violence.
Right.
And figuring that out, and in understanding that journey for myself, it really allowed me to get to the utterance of Me Too, right? And it's right around when Tarana Burke founds the Me Too organization, and right around when Aisha Simmons' film No is finally coming out, and really is one of the first major films that documents sexual violence, period, but specifically about Black women and girls.
The issue of rape, domestic violence, sexual assault, which happens within the African American community, is an issue that we need to bring out of the closet. We have to raise the issues. We have to address it in our own communities.
This is not a feel-good book.
No.
But there's a moment in joy in the book. For me, it was just oh so Black. You know, you talk about the time you spent with your dad, rest in peace, Papa Lindsey, in the car, as he goes to the liquor store to play your mom's numbers and get you a snack. I'm like, wow, this is so Black.
Shout out to Malcolm's on Benning Road in Northeast DC.
And the music that the two of you would listen to in the car, right?
Yes.
And in this instance, it's an introduction to NWA's Fuck the Police. Talk a little bit about, as you do this work, and even dealing with your own interactions with violence, how important was it to have a father who listened? You know, even when you make that call to them,
Yes.
you know, you talk about him answering the phone, hey baby girl, the way that he always did. How important was it for you in this journey, you know, to have a father who was thoughtful and listening around these issues?
Ooh, I mean, you know, I don't know. I'm actually certain, I won't say I don't know. I know my father would not have identified as like a feminist father,
right.
but he and I talked about, before he passed away, writing a book, what it meant to raise a Black feminist daughter. He wanted to write something of what it meant. He's like, my world is very different, but I've just journeyed with you. And, you know, he had so much emotional capacity and really cared, right? That's someone who, both of my parents were invested in care-provoking work, which is what I feel like I try and model in my own work. But he was so instrumental in being not just present, but wanting to see the person I would become, and deeply invested in creating an environment in which that could actualize. So I had a lot of freedom to explore, to ask certain questions. I still got some of the, the Black parent because I said so. That absolutely happens. But I think they recognized my curiosity very early on. They recognized my sense of justice very early on. I was able to take dance classes because my mom worked at a certain school, but the kids in my neighborhood couldn't. So I would come home, and I started a summer camp. So I would teach them what I was learning at the dance camp. And I put on a recital. Parents actually let me have their children for hours, being a child myself. I got community sponsors. Shout out to Jerry Subs and Pizza back in the day and the carry out to sponsor this event. But it was this sense that I always had parents who saw that and saw that I was figuring out what justice meant, what freedom meant for a Black girl growing up in Northeast DC in the 80s, then moves to PG County and then goes to this elite middle school, private school in Washington, DC, and is trying to figure out what it means to stand her ground as who she is amidst this, and always just wanted to be a soft space to land, because essentially my parents were soft places to land. Right. And it meant a lot to see that model of Black masculinity very early on in my life, right? Because I knew other forms of masculinity were possible. I saw my father intervene in interpersonal dynamics. I saw him hold people in his life accountable who were violent towards other people in their lives, particularly to women and girls in their lives. And so I had a model in that of Black masculinity that let me know that the very narrow white supremacist patriarchal construction of Black manhood that felt so limiting and encasing was by no means the only way. And with that, it gave me a deep love and a deep care. So when I get to an instance when I see a brother hitting a young woman, my first care, of course, is to that sister and making sure she's okay. But I also want to dig deeper with that brother, because I'm like, we got to not do this to one another. There are many things here that predispose us towards premature death. Why are we predisposing one another? And not in this pathological way, but in this deeply caring way that says, I see you, and we have to not be each other's pain.
Talk a little bit about the Black Feminist Night School. You mentioned this intervention that you made as a child. You're continuing to make these interventions with things like the Black Feminist Night School.
Yes, so Black Feminist Night School is an incredible partnership that I had to do with Zora's House, which is this amazing space in Columbus, Ohio, founded by a Duke alum, LC. She's class of 08, I believe, from Duke. And she founded this, gotten land literally in Columbus, built her house on one part of the land and then a community house on the other part of it. And there's a library, there's space, there's rest spaces, there's work, it's co-working, it's programming. It's just a haven for women and gender expansive people of color. And they're now building a new amazing building that's gonna be open in 2024. And so I got a fellowship where I got to partner with Zora's House, because it's about the humanities beyond the academy. How do we bring the humanities outside of that? And I get this in March of 2020. So I had all these plans about these things I was gonna do in this space, and we were so excited, and then of course, COVID. So we have to recalibrate.
Have to pivot.
And so we decide that we want some kind of community learning space that's still gonna pivot around Black feminism, but what if we make it a virtual monthly convening that's open to everyone? We make it at 9 o'clock, it's completely free, it's open, we're building a resource list together, we're building programming together, we're chatting, we have people from 3 continents represented coming forth there, and it became this incredible community learning space where people who were never gonna be in my classrooms for whatever reason get to sit and think with Audre Lorde, Sadia Hartman, Marsha P. Johnson. They get to think with all of these individuals and bring their knowledge to the fore And the next iteration of that is we're having Black Feminist Night School Presents Summer School this upcoming summer, which is going to be a community learning space that's for people in the community for a concentrated period of time to really do an in-depth study of the practice, and theory of Black feminism. So we're doing hip hop herstories right now, where we have a different speaker every other month to kind of give us a little something about Hip Hop 50 from different perspectives. So we've had Joan Morgan, we've had Sophia Chang, we have Shanita Hubbard coming up, we're doing a screening of On the Record. So we just have a lot of different kinds of programs that are really meant to center community and to think about Black feminist practice as a shared knowledge process, that this is not about me being the expert and the singular person in this room who can bring something. It's about what we can exchange and what offers healing, what offers spaces for pleasure, what offers spaces for joy. I'm always invested, despite being someone who writes about violence and systemic oppression, that I'm always trying to find life-affirming ways to do that, because there's an incredible amount of joy in Black feminism as well. There's an incredible amount of play that happens. And so I'm equally invested in the battleground that we operate in, as well as the playground that we get to delight in and create in.
What's next for you?
Few things. So currently working on a book with UNC Press, their trade outpost, called Words Mean Things. And thinking through these kind of Black feminist histories of certain words, phrases, and terms are articulations of freedom dreams. And in a moment where I'm writing testimony to protect my right to say what I say in my classroom in the state of Ohio, and many educators across the country are facing this, policymakers are facing this, how we anchor into the roots. So how do we anchor something like Me Too back to a Black trans woman giving testimony to Congress about being sexually violated? And it also gives us another history of like the 14th Amendment, what equal protection means. So I'm working on that, and I'm in the very, very, very early stages of a project called A Love Letter to Black Feminism. And working through, one of the things I noticed is that I love letter as a form. So at the end of America Goddam, I write a letter to Micaiah Bryant. In a special double issue of The Black Scholar, where I was one of the co-editors, I wrote a love letter to Black feminism in there. When I'm grading my graduate students' papers, the first response I give back to them is a letter. And so I realized this is a form that I'm really thinking through, but I want to think through how different Black feminists and kind of schools of thought within Black feminism have shaped my practice as a feminist. So looking at that and looking at letters they wrote to other Black feminists to really think about letter writing and intimate practices of political commitment.
The book is America Goddam, Violence, Black Women, and the Struggle for Justice, just published in paperback. I have to tell you, while we're still on camera, I am so very, very, very proud of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That means everything. That means everything.
Left the Black.
Blacks, they be hyping, I'm the light that lit your match. A black watch for all the times I watch MTV raps. Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything.